welcome to this edition of the ABGG seminar. I'm here to introduce Nicole Sharpe, who is a very dear friend of mine. She graduated from UC Davis in 2009 with a BS in evolution and ecology and came into the ABGG the next fall at the ripe old age of 20. In fact, our first cohort hangout was her 21st birthday at Sophia's, which made me feel super old at 24. She's an amazing biologist, particularly field biologist. I study cricket, so my idea of a field season is going to the Davis tennis courts and picking crickets up off the ground. Her idea of a field season is spending 2 years in Africa, where she would spend every day, or nearly every day, collecting behavioral data and dealing with what sounded like an inordinate amount of chimp species. In 2012, she was in Kenya at the Old Pejima Conservancy, studying captive chimps. And then in 2013, she was in the Congo at the Chimpanzee Reserve, where she got to drink whiskey with the one and only Jane Goodall. Very jealous. And she got to care for all the baby chimps. Very jealous as well. She's one of the most industrious people I've ever met. She's not working on her dissertation or riding horses. She's canning vegetables, making her own jams, jellies, marmalades, curds, olives, pickles, kombucha, meat and vegetables, stocks, second Thanksgivings, cheeses, oven-dried tomatoes, Halloween costumes, cakes, pies, donuts, scones, quiches, just about anything else. I'm sure I'm missing a bunch of stuff. And she also is an excellent TA. We got to TA together last summer. It was excellent. We have been friends for many years. I tried to put it into words what she needs to be on a personal level, and everything came up short. So I'll just say she's one of the best friends you could ask for, and she's always there for you, particularly if what you need is food related. And I guess the best way I can put it is that I'm currently doing whatever I can in my devious planning to make sure she lives nearby me for the rest of my life. But today she's going to talk about personality, individual behavior, and the social dynamics in chimpanzees.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. That was definitely the biggest picture into someone's life I've ever heard in one of these introductions. And now I do feel a little bit guilty that I didn't bring you any food today. Hopefully you can forgive me. So we know that personality and personalities exist, right? And I don't think that I have to work very hard to convince anyone in this room that the study of personality is valuable in understanding animal behavior. And we know that animal personalities influence all kind of things like dispersal, predator-prey dynamics, social dynamics, foraging, among many, many others. And from the human literature, we actually have a fairly good understanding, or at least we have some in-depth understanding of how personality influences friendships in people, as well as how groups function. So in people, friendships tend to be based on similarities in personality, specifically similarities in the factors of gregariousness, or sociality, or sociability, and openness to new experience. So instinctively, these things make sense, right? Gregarious people are more likely to hang out with other people and spend more time with other people. But what we see in these patterns is that people who are less gregarious, in addition to having fewer friends, the friends they have are also less gregarious. So it's not simply that social people have all the friends, both social and unsocial, or less social. In terms of openness to new experience, it's often thought that, similar choices of vocation or leisure activities are what influence human friendship in that regard. So I can tell you that I would probably never have been friends with Nick had we not been in the same graduate program together, right? And in terms of, interestingly, in terms of group functioning, we often see an interesting effect of heterophily in relationships and the functioning of at least small groups of humans. So while friends might be similar, in the workplace, oftentimes complementary personalities that are a little bit different have better productivity overall. But what we don't really know, and what hasn't been investigated to a large degree, is how personality influences the social relationships in animals. So we do know that there are many determinants of association in animals, right? There's kinship, matrilines in primates, as well as many other species, are often found together, as well as other maternal kin. And we see a lot of association between individuals that have the same age or the same rank. But as far as personality goes, the literature is still lacking in how personality affects these association patterns. This is interesting because strong relationships in animals provide both direct and indirect benefits. So we see things like increased infant survival. There have been a lot of studies on this in baboons. Breeding success in all kinds of primates. And I will just interrupt myself here to say that you will find I am a very primate-biased literature referencer, probably to no one's surprise. Social dominance, which influences both breeding success and infant survival. Food sharing, and decreased stress, right? And we see these effects, these direct and indirect benefits in animals across many different taxa. But what we also see in many different taxa is that animals will associate strongly with individuals that are not kin. And because all of these things have fitness benefits, it's usually hypothesized that such strong relationships evolved out of kinship. Also, friends tend to cooperate more productively, so this is notable in primates. In chimpanzees, for example, this is a really common cognitive task that chimpanzees are asked to perform, where both individuals must participate in order to receive a food reward. If one or the other participates alone, the food cannot be achieved. And what we see is that pairs of chimps that are food sharers outside of cognitive testing can, in fact, cooperate to succeed at this task. However, if you take a pair of chimps, both of whom succeed with other partners, and put them together, if those two chimps do not share food outside of the task, they are typically incapable of completing the task, even if the food is divided between them very clearly. And then, of course, in primates, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, is that friends provide one another with large degrees of social support. So going back to this idea of kinship, often it is thought that kinship is a big part of the evolution of cooperation and social support. But across all kinds of taxa, primates and non-primates, we see cooperation and association and strong association between animals that are unrelated. In male chimpanzees, we see that they are as likely to interact with individuals that are not related to them as they are with individuals that are closely related to them. So this study looked at the the proportion of dyads that are performing these affiliative behaviors. And it looked specifically at the proportion of dyads that are closely related in white or distantly related in gray. And as you can see, there were many more distantly related dyads performing these behaviors than the closely related ones. All of these dyads associated more frequently than chance, right? So more frequently than chance, individuals are hanging out with distantly related members of their group compared to closely related group members. Which is interesting because in this study, the individuals there definitely had closely related relatives available to them. Furthermore, in the same study, when the authors looked at just dyads that associate more often than chance in white and less frequently than chance in gray, there was no difference in the genetic relatedness of those dyads. Cooperation is a really important behavior in chimpanzees. So this is a rather famous behavior, but chimpanzees tend to embark on territorial patrols, and they do so with some frequency. So territorial patrols, in case you haven't watched Disney movie Chimpanzee or Planet Earth, is when groups of males will embark and typically range either on the edge of their territory or on the outside of their territory. And they do so together. And these are important behaviors not only for maintaining a territory, but it's important because they will occasionally interact with chimpanzees from other groups, and these interactions can end in lethal aggression. Territorial patrols are also very important for chimpanzees in terms of maintaining a territory size. So on the left here is the territory that was occupied by the Ngogo chimpanzees between the years 1999 and 2000. And each of these little black tracks represents a territorial patrol that the researchers identified or followed the chimpanzees on. So you can see there's a strong cluster of territorial patrols up here in the northeast. On the right is the same territory, but each dot indicates a location where lethal intergroup aggression occurred. So the focal group of chimpanzees, in this case, each of these dots represents a place where another chimpanzee from a different community was killed. And in 2009, the Ngogo community managed to expand their territory to include a portion of this area where they had patrolled strongly. And as you can see, there were quite a number of lethal encounters. Chimpanzees live in multi-male and multi-female groups. They are very large, and they typically spend most of their day in smaller subgroups within the community. Chimpanzees are male philopatric, which means that the males live in their natal community forever, and females disperse. So when females disperse into a new community, they are typically subject to a fair bit of harassment from other individuals in the community, both males and females. So in order to avoid such harassment, dispersing or incoming females are benefited by making close associations with the males of their community. And long-term studies on chimps have shown that females will form enduring social bonds with other females in their community. And those bands together can avoid harassment by both males and other females. And of course, the females that were once harassed in a community, now that they have girlfriends, become the harassers. This harassment is important for chimps because it has both long-term and short-term effects on health and fitness. Additionally, chimps typically live in groups of about 5 to 20 adult males with similar numbers of adult females and juveniles. And they have a strict male hierarchy that people often think of as enforced very much by aggressive behaviors, which it is, but sociality, or chimps spend a lot of time performing social behaviors as well. So we often catch them playing or grooming during foraging bouts when food is available. As I mentioned, the males are territorial and they patrol the boundaries of their territory. And the benefits of being a high-ranking male chimp are beyond just access to food. You actually get a greater access to paternity opportunities. So high-ranking male chimpanzees can father between 30% and 80% of the offspring that are born during their tenure as an alpha. And this tends to depend on the size of the community and the community that people are looking at. So in this case, this alpha male fathered 30% of the offspring, and the group he was in had 12 males. So this contributes to all of the individuals in a group being fairly closely related. They, especially individuals of a similar age, tend to be fathered by the same male, and the other individuals around them will tend to be fairly closely related as well. Chimpanzees are actually under a fair bit of threat right now because their territories and habitats are being closely encroached upon by hunters. And one of the side effects of hunting chimpanzees for meat is that infant chimpanzees end up being sold as pets. And chimpanzees make terrible pets, in case you guys weren't aware of what happened in Ohio. And these pets, there are a lot of chimpanzee sanctuaries that have kind of sprung up across Africa to deal with the many orphan chimpanzees that are discarded as pets. Law enforcement is getting better and better, and chimpanzees are now being brought into sanctuaries at a much younger age, so they just kind of bypass the whole pet side of things. Excuse me. So when I started this project, I actually had when I started my dissertation, I had a completely different project in mind, based on this problem of chimpanzees in sanctuaries, which was that chimps were being brought into sanctuaries at a fairly high rate and being raised in these, by people who just were kind of thrown into this situation. And I was intending, based on my background in studying infant primate development, to look at these chimpanzees and their personality development, as well as their social housing conditions, to see if I could provide any advice or useful data to help chimpanzee sanctuaries raise infants a little bit more naturally and provide them with better housing and social enrichment. But it turns out that chimpanzee sanctuaries have access to resources that no one in the US could ever dream of, such as 200 square hectare islands that their chimps can live on. And when your chimpanzee habitat looks like this, inside an enclosure, you don't really need a graduate student to tell you that your social enrichment or your environmental enrichment could be improved, because really it can't. But instead, what I did have access to was groups of chimps that lived in very, very similar environments, right? All in these fairly naturalistic habitats, in groups of similar size that I would find in the wild, that I could ask some questions about things like group dynamics and how personality influences association patterns without the constraints of ecology, predation, or true kinship. And so that was what I started to base my dissertation on. And my study goals that I will explain today were to explore how personality influences relationship patterns in chimpanzees and gain some kind of understanding of how personality influences group dynamics in chimps. I conducted my study, as Jamie said earlier, at 2 sanctuaries. So one was located in Kenya and the other one in Republic of Congo. So not the big Congo, which is here, but the small Congo, which no one knows about. I worked with 5 groups of chimps. I worked with 2 groups at Sweetwaters in Kenya, and they had 14 and 23 individuals each. And I worked with 3 groups at Chimpunga, where I had 23, 24, and 25 individuals to work with. This is a satellite map of the enclosure at Sweetwaters. So the long sides of this enclosure are 1 kilometer. And what I would do is walk around the enclosure and observe the chimps from the outside. So obviously there's a large portion of this enclosure that I could not observe. The 2 chimpanzee groups at Sweetwaters were separated by the river, which is a very effective fence. So these are fairly large enclosures, especially by US standards. And this entire sanctuary is the size of some small zoos, right? So to conduct behavioral observations, I did daily behavioral observations, as I said, from outside of the enclosures. And depending on the amount of time the chimps spent in the enclosures during the day, I was there for between 3 and 8 hours. I spent 5 months at both sanctuaries, and I got about 200 hours per group. I used scan sampling, which is observing the state of behavior that chimpanzees are in, or that individuals you're studying are in, to get social states such as subgroup membership, proximity, contact, grooming, and play. And I event sampled all affiliative interactions, so anything where grooming or play or subordination, for examples of affiliative interactions, as well as both contact and non-contact aggression, which will come up a little bit later. For our personality assessment, we did not do behavioral testing. So it's really challenging to do open field testing or even really any behavioral testing with chimps, especially in a sanctuary setting. So what we did was we used a personality questionnaire that was developed on captive chimpanzees to assess personality. So as an example, so this personality questionnaire had about, I think it was like 42 traits on it that we had every chimp rated on every trait by as many raters as possible. But as an example, so we would say, the trait persistent would have a definition next to it, which is subject tends to continue in a course of action, task, or strategy for a long time, or continues despite opposition from other chimps. So, during my PhD, I would probably give myself a 6 for persistence. And just as a little anecdote from the field, this female, I witnessed her every single day using a stick to test the electricity on the fence. So every day she would check to make sure the fence was on by pressing one of the electric lines against a grounded line with a stick and waiting for the snap. And then she would occasionally try to escape. So this was her one day with a caregiver trying to deter her from escaping. And you can imagine it was not to my great surprise one day when I showed up and she had opened the fence to a hole about this big, which I did not take pictures of because I was busy running away. So she also got a very high persistency score, right? So another trait, for example, is cautious. So subject seems attentive to possible harm or danger from its actions. Subject avoids risky behaviors. And so what we did was we had as many caregivers as possible use these definitions specifically to rate as many chimps as possible. The personality questionnaire has been validated against both behavior as well as validated by looking at different populations of chimps that have been studied. So a couple of studies in the past have looked at the personality ratings used at different captive facilities, and the variance that occurs across all of the chimpanzees is much greater than the variance that can be accounted for by facility, which suggests that it's a relatively robust personality questionnaire. And additionally, we do find a pretty good relationship between certain behaviors and certain aspects of personality. So for example, grooming and sociable are quite tightly correlated. I did a confirmatory factor analysis on my data, which supported a previously found 6-factor personality structure, which was from the same study that developed this personality questionnaire. This structure included bold, included bold, agreeable, open, conscientious, and extroverted. This is just an example of the traits that you find in each factor. So all of that being said, I am looking specifically into grooming relationships in chimps. And based on the human personality literature and what we know about chimp behavior in the wild, I had a couple of predictions about why grooming would be more frequent among some dyads than others. So one, I suggested, oh, not a laser pointer. I thought that grooming would be, more frequent grooming would be present in dyads with similar personality, as well as dyads with similar age. And I suspected that grooming would be directed up the hierarchy, which is one method that individuals can use to receive social support, right? So I look at grooming. Grooming is an important social behavior for chimpanzees, and it offers both tangible and intangible benefits. There's the real things that grooming, reduces parasite load and can possibly perform wound care, as well as just the comfort of the association. And the intangible benefits include, future social support, as well as, future social support for ease. So grooming is important. There's a lot of evidence that grooming is important, but one big piece to me is that primates will groom one another even when food resources are scarce. So they give up the option to forage additionally to perform grooming, which says that it is, to me at least, fairly important. So in order to count the frequency of grooming relationships, we counted the number of times each dyad was observed grooming, and we included random effects for each initiator and recipient. And this was to help account for the fact that each chimpanzee, if you recall, those enclosures are really big, and I can't see everyone all the time. And some individuals may have just been inherently less observable than others. So hopefully this would help account for those differences in observation. Our best model that predicted chimpanzee grooming frequency included personality, age, and sex. So what we found was important was the absolute difference in a dyad's sociable score, the absolute difference in their extroverted score, absolute difference in age, as well as recipient age at meeting, which I'll explain in more detail in a minute, and initiator sex. In general, we did find that grooming relationships were more frequent among individuals with similar sociable scores. So here we have the absolute difference in sociable, 0 meaning you have essentially the same score, and 3 being a large difference. Now, we didn't look at the directed difference in sociable or in any of our personality factors, actually, because those measures tended to be symmetric and we couldn't get good predictions made from them. So individuals that are closer in sociable score grew more than those that are different. Additionally, we found a similar effect with age that varied for females and males. So for females, there's a negligible, if slightly positive, effective difference in age, whereas in males, there is the same decrease in grooming for dyads of different ages. When we looked at any interaction that involved males actually resulted in the interesting effect where males tended to groom much more conservatively. So we saw that when males were similar in sociable, here we have actually an interaction between age and sociable. So dyads that are the same age, right, males that are the same age had a small effect of difference in their personality on grooming, whereas dyads of males that had a different age had a larger effect of grooming on their personality. And I should clarify, though I just said dyads of males, I actually meant dyads where the male is the initiator. So they could have been grooming a female or a male. So I'm going to leave off talking about males for now because their results were a little bit more conservative, and I will just talk about the interactions with females. We did find an interaction between dyad difference in age and sociable. All right, so what we found was that for dyads that had a similar age, there was 0 difference in their age, the effect of sociable on grooming frequency was limited. This makes a lot of, the way sanctuaries are structured, individuals come into sanctuaries and are put into age-matched groups. So you don't get a 1-year-old in and put him in with a bunch of 5-year-olds. You put the 1-year-old with the other 1-year-old. So if you think about individuals that have 0 age difference at most sanctuaries, they've known that other individual for essentially their entire lives to date. So this seems to suggest that if you have a strong familiarity with individuals, the difference in your sociable score doesn't seem to matter in terms of grooming. And as dyad difference, you can't really tell the difference in that color, but I swear it's different. Dyad difference in age increased, the importance of having the same personality becomes apparent. So what we see is that for dyads where there's a large difference in age, 25 years in age, only grooming occurred actually rather frequently between individuals of similar personality and drops off very steeply. There's also an interaction between the personality trait extroverted as well as the age the recipient met the initiator. So based on sanctuary records, I was able to infer at what age any 2 individuals in a dyad were when they first met one another or when they were first put into a social group together. So if you were younger at meeting, right, you met, regardless of the age of the initiator, these recipients were young when they met the other member of their dyad, and these recipients were old when they met the other member of their dyad. So what we see is that as the recipient of the grooming becomes older, the similarity in personality is important, right? We're seeing that with a smaller difference in extroverted, older recipients receive less grooming, which is actually interesting. And I'll explain that in a second. But as the difference in extroverted increases, the recipient or the grooming in the dyad increases with the recipient's age increasing. And I finally ended up with a positive slope for individuals that had a really big difference in this extroverted score, even though they met their recipient when the recipient was quite old. Now, to explain this, we have to talk a little bit about the progress of human and chimpanzee personality over time. So studies have been done in humans showing that personality tends to become more, I would say, muted is one way of saying it over time. But basically, scores on personalities in older individuals tend to be much lower than in younger individuals. And I know this doesn't really mesh with our definition of personality as a trait that doesn't vary over time. But if you think about it, these older individuals are still, you know, an old individual who was very extroverted in their youth is probably still more extroverted than their age mates. And so in chimpanzees, we actually see an even steeper drop-off in extroverted score than in humans, right? The chimpanzees are the solid triangles. And so if we think back to this line, for individuals to have a large difference in extroverted score, it is very likely a dyad between a young female and an older individual. And then that makes a lot of sense here with the recipient age at meeting being older. This young female is grooming an individual who was already well established in the group when they were introduced, and it may provide them with possible social benefits to groom. So to go back to our predictions about grooming relationships, we did find that individuals of similar personality groomed more, particularly in males. The similarity in personality was important for frequency of grooming. Oh, right, so this is just my male graph compared to my female graph on the same interaction. And you see females groom outside of their similarity or age class much more than males. In addition, grooming was more frequent among individuals in similar age groups. However, we did not find any evidence that grooming was directed at all within the hierarchy. So neither rank nor rank difference came out in any of our models. So to change tracks just a little bit, the other part of my, the other thing I wanted to look at in this study, or in this talk particularly, was how personality influences group dynamics. And I will admit to you that when I started this study, I was really excited because I thought that this would be the perfect way. You know, I have all these groups, 5, to look at how, you know, these different personalities are changing group dynamics. 5 groups is not a lot of groups. And so what I focused on, based on both the some talks that I had with sanctuary management as well as with people who study wild chimpanzees, at first I focused on this alpha male personality. There's some anecdotal evidence that when alpha males turn over in groups, the kind of tone of that group will change. Unfortunately, it's not possible to know what directed that, right? We don't know if the group becomes more relaxed because this alpha male left, or if the group was really tense because that alpha male was on his way out. These are the kinds of things that I couldn't extricate. But in order to look at this, based on what I had heard from sanctuary management, I decided to look at the frequency of aggression in these captive groups and see if alpha male personality played any role in that. So what we did find was that alpha male personality, the proportion of provisioned observations, which is the feeding observations, as well as the density of the night house were important. And I will explain these in a little bit more detail as we go. So for predicted fights, for the number of fights per day, alpha male extroverted score was predicted to be, an increase in alpha male extroverted score predicted an increase in fights per day. An extroverted male can be described as one who is playful and friendly and is not solitary or lazy, whereas a low-scoring extroverted male might be solitary, less active, and not as friendly or playful. So as you get to these more active, playful, friendly males, the number of fights per day increases. This was weird, but it has actually nothing to do with what the males are doing. We looked at the frequency of fights males started, as well as the number of interventions males performed, and that had no bearing on the number of fights per day in a group. So I'm not really sure what is the interaction between alpha male personality and fighting here. So when we looked at proportion of provisioned observations, we also found a positive effect. So provisioning is when you feed the chimps, in case you're not familiar, or feed any animal, right? And the number of provisioned observations, feeding is a really stressful time for chimps, both in the wild and in captivity. It causes a lot of activity as well as possible aggression, both just displacement aggression as individuals kind of bustle around trying to get food, as well as actual physical fights over food. And the proportion of observations that I conducted on any day that were during feeding had this really negligible, well, okay, I keep saying negligible. I think it's a really minor effect, especially when you compare it to the size of the effect of the alpha male, right? Which kind of goes against what a lot of captive management have thought in the past, which is that feeding is a time when animals must be really strictly managed in order to avoid fighting. And then finally, we saw this effect of night house density. So as I mentioned earlier, chimpanzees sleep in night houses in captivity, and this is because the fences at the sanctuary turn off when the sun goes down because they're solar powered. And much like at Jurassic Park, you do not want to be there when the power goes out. Chimps sleep in these concrete night houses, and they're provided bedding material of straw or cardboard or shredded paper or blankets. And individual chimps will build their own little nest to sleep in. So a 5 square meter or 5 meter by 5 meter room is designed to hold 5 chimpanzees. So 25 square meters for 5 chimps. But based on hospitalization needs or, even who is choosing to sleep with whom that night or what is going on in the night and other management needs, you can sometimes have up to 12 chimpanzees in one of these rooms, which is, as you can imagine, a fairly crowded room. And understandably, the density of chimpanzees in the night house suggests an increase in predicted fights per day. There was also an interaction between the alpha personality and night house density. So we saw that for low densities of the night house, the alpha male personality was less important than when density in the night house was very high. So in conclusion, I did find that personality similarity tends to predict relationship strength. right? We have individuals that are more similar tend to spend more time grooming, with a couple of caveats for females. Also age and, essentially I think of it as the time together, the time individuals have known one another is important in determining grooming relationships. This actually raises some interesting questions about kinship, at least for me. So there's a lot of thought about how animals can identify kin. Okay, that's not happening. How animals identify their kin, and it's really, it's difficult to study and it's not very well known. So is it really true that this individual who gave birth to this baby, right, views her more as kin out of the fact that they have true kinship any more than these two individuals who've spent their entire knowing lives together? And the result of, or studies on other on chimps in other systems have shown that grooming is more frequent among individuals that are kin. And my results suggest that individuals that have known one another for a long time also groom more frequently. So while it doesn't solve any questions about kinship, it does make me think a little bit about these possible recognition of kinship, right? Is it just simply the fact that they've grown up together and they've known one another for their entire lives? But it could also just be that having known someone for your entire life, you're more used to them and are more interested in grooming them, right? In terms of management, I think that this does have some interesting implications and suggests that individuals, if they have to be moved, should be moved with grooming partners or individuals at least who have a similar age or personality. And while this might seem really intuitive to anyone who is listening to this, captive chimpanzee, all captive animal sanctuaries or zoos have to make these management decisions about moving animals that have nothing to do with the welfare of the animal. It's usually about genetics or housing. And so you can't necessarily just pull an animal's best friend along with them because you think that's what will be the best thing for them, because that could ultimately destabilize groups. And I know that management often agonizes about these decisions of who to move and how and where to move them. So it's possible, that even if you can't move an individual's best friend, you can at least provide them with an individual they'll get along with by picking someone of a similar age or personality. And then finally, I think I found that personality is associated with group dynamics, although there is clearly much more to investigate in this regard. I looked at it in a very coarse manner, and that alpha males can have an influence on group functioning. The really interesting thing I think here is that the night house density and provisioning had both had effects that were not exactly what people think. So provisioning doesn't have as strong of an effect as management tends to think on frequency of fighting, and night house density does. And so with that, I would like to acknowledge everyone who has helped me through this process, and will continue to help me as I finish, including my advisor Brenda and my research assistant Dinah and my committee members John and Rob. This is not a real exit. I refuse to think of this as a real exit seminar because I'm not quite that close to done. So I'm not giving the full exit seminar acknowledgements or thank yous, but there was a lot of support provided to me by the Chimpunga people as well as the Sweetwater Sanctuary, and then of course the many ABGG students who have provided a lot of support to me throughout my time. And with that, I am happy to take any questions. Marisano.
This is just general. So I don't think I understand the factors versus traits.
Yeah. So personality traits, factors comprise multiple traits. So you have a personality factor like extroverted includes multiple dimensions in terms of the traits. So it has things like friendly, playful, lazy, solitary, whereas the trait solitary simply describes an individual who doesn't spend much time with other individuals. Yeah. Thanks, Jennifer. Andy.
Loads of questions. But, actually, just to start with, did you test for whether or not partners or just possible dyads that were similar in personality were actually more likely to groom per unit of any sort of association, or just more likely to groom in general. You know, this is sort of like, do they just associate more, or do they in particular even groom more than you would think from just the fact that they're near each other?
Right, so you're saying, the short answer is no, but because I had thought that I would be able to control, or at least in some way account for some of the variance in seeing individuals with the random effects. But what I am thinking of now of adding into this analysis is including who you choose to groom based on who is around you. So do you groom the individual that is most similar to you out of everyone in this room, or do you groom the individual that is most similar to you out of everyone possibly available, even the individuals that are not here right now?
Right, so for each observation, you know who are the individuals that are close enough to possibly, and I mean, we can talk about it more. We've actually just done a similar analysis on sortative mating patterns in what we study. Put in that element of the analysis, and it makes a difference.
Yeah, no, it's definitely something I am interested in doing. Yeah.
And if no one else has another question,
let's just chat.
Just ask for. Like, you didn't say anything about, I don't think, about sort of quality of grooming or even sort of reciprocity.
No, you're right. And so length and the reciprocity of grooming are the next things that I need to add into this. I just actually had a really good meeting on Wednesday where I thought about all of these things, but that was like 48 hours ago. So no, so I do have lengths of grooming, and I also have reciprocity of grooming. And so the next analysis that I have to, and this is why I said I'm not done, right? So the next things I do want to look at is, are you more likely to groom an individual who is just going to groom you back? Because we do see evidence in primates that reciprocity in grooming is important in who you select to groom. Yes, Mara-san.
Along those lines, can you say more about like provisioning? So are these already fairly well-fed chimps? Totally
well-fed. They fight for sport. There's no reason, like no one will ever go unfed in these groups. The caregivers take great pains to make sure that everyone gets the food they need to. And so it's really just a matter of like pecking order, and food is exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. So what you might see when you're watching like wild chimps might be different.
Totally different, and especially the value of food items, right? So the food that chimps receive in captivity, though it is, like especially at sanctuaries, they receive this diet of fresh fruit and vegetables all the time. But in the wild, everyone has their own preferences, but for the most part, fresh fruit and vegetables is items of the exact same food quality. But in the wild, you see huge variance in food quality. Chimps are feeding on fresh fruit at certain times of year. They'll fight over meat. Like they fight way more over meat, I think, than they do over other food items. And then, in fallback times when they're eating leaves and bark, why fight? So, yeah.
So on the personality and sort of fighting rate of the whole group, are you implying that basically you need a nasty dictator to keep down the fighting, and that a friendly alpha male just is too friendly?
It's
just fight, and no one's sort of scaring them.
No, it's a really good question. I cannot explain this at all. And so to help kind of elucidate these results, I'm also going to look at the composition of subgroups and see if we can have any understanding of fighting that occurs in smaller subgroups. So in these enclosures, the really big ones that you saw, there's no way for chimps who are on the far side of an enclosure, right? It's a kilometer away, to get to a fight in time, on the other side of the enclosure, to get to a fight in time to break it up. But in one of my enclosures, I did have a situation where it's similar to a primate center-sized enclosure where, you can run 100 meters across the enclosure in time to break a fight up. So, this kind of subgrouping could affect fighting in these subgroups, or just even behavior within the subgroups. So that's where I'm going with that. John?
So we've done some analysis similar to yours, looking at pairing success out at the primate center here. And one of the issues that comes up is the idea of the different scores, which we talked a little bit about this. Mm-hmm. And there's an issue we're thinking about of whether a difference of one has the same meaning across the spread of scores. So there's a difference between an animal that's a 7 and a 6. The same as the difference between
as a 3 and a 4
and a 3.
Wow.
The difference between a 1 and a 2.
Yeah, especially because my feeling on Likert scales, so the rating scale of 1 to 7, 1, not at all, 7 the most. I personally feel like that's a fairly normal scale. Most people fall between a 3 and a 4.
Right.
So, yeah, you're right. The difference between a 3 and a 4 is probably really difference between a 1 and a 2.
Yeah.
So that's where the average.
So there's a difference. So there's an issue of kind of not only the difference, but there's an issue also of level.
Yeah, the level.
We sort of tried to deal with it. We've talked a little bit.
Yeah, it was
about
the
this.
averages.
We throw into our analysis also the mean value of the animals as well, to just try to control for where they are in that scale. So
yeah, that is. I should look into that. I really should look into that interaction.
yeah, nobody's got an answer for it, but it's just something to think about. Especially with most of the animals being in that 3-4 range.
Yeah. Yes, Jennifer?
I don't know if I'm confused, but when you're talking about the females and you showed the ones with the really great age difference, you think some of those are being groomed by a younger female?
Yes.
And then you said you didn't find an effect of social rank in general.
Oh, yeah. So age doesn't necessarily relate to rank.
Okay.
And especially in female chimps, rank can be really difficult to determine because their signaling is unclear. So rank for females is hard, yeah.
So why do you think the younger ones are grooming the older ones?
I suspect it has to do with avoiding harassment, at least in my study groups, I think. So they could be grooming older females or older males, but by grooming those individuals, they're potentially avoiding future aggression from them.
So, how does patrolling vary with the alpha male's personality?
Oh man, that is such a good question, and no one in the wild is studying it. And I don't know why. And okay, so even beyond that, just anecdotally, right? This graph I showed you of the community that killed all their neighbors and took over their territory, right? So if you recall from Jane Goodall's early studies at Gombe, that exact same thing happened at her study site. And her study, she had one group that had 18 males, and it split into 2 groups of 9, and then one of them just annihilated the other one. But 2 groups of 9 males that used to live together, used to cooperate, and they're all the same age, size-ish, there were no demographic differences there, and some can do it, and some can just kill other groups and take over their territory, and some can't. So then, anecdotally, from both Jane's site as well as John Matani's site at Ngogo, there are certain individuals that in the middle of feeding will get up and walk away, and everyone follows them. And, then they go out and they kill their neighbors. It's just really hard to analyze across different sites. And, to be able to observe these groups when alpha males turn over and to actually see differences, that too is challenging.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thanks, guys.